Perfect. So, yeah, thank you so much for everyone joining us today. Welcome to part three of our four-part series. With us again is Alan Culp, a professor of religion at Baldwin Wallace University and a Kendal at Home member. And joining him is one of his students, Sammy Leffler. And so today's session is going to be focusing on human well-being and wholeness. So without further ado, Alan, if you want to take it away, I'll share the screen for you. And I'm
welcome to everybody.
Listen to you, not me. So,
well, if you got something to say, we'll happily do that. You know, the Quakers think everybody has some value and can contribute. So, I've been a Quaker all my life, and hope to get it right someday. You know, there's such diversity among Quakers. I'm not sure what getting it right means. So, but that's a topic for a different day. So delighted to see all of you again, and I'm especially happy to have Sammy with me still. Sammy is a student with me currently in a class we're doing called Contemplative Spirituality, which does some work around some of these themes. We do a little more than we can do in a full-week series that I'm doing here. And you can imagine what it's like to do something topically like this with a bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds. It's a very different age group for me. So I feel like I'm on the generational slide scale here. I've got more in common with most of you on the screen than I do with Sammy in some ways. So delighted to be here. This is the third session. We'll finish up next week after a hiatus with Thanksgiving. So it seems like it's been longer than 2 weeks ago when we were together. Let me just summarize in about 1 minute, which sets the context for where we'll jump in today. The first day we talked pretty generally about spirituality, about well-being, and the wholeness of life. I see those three pieces that were in the title as aspects probably of the same kind of life that we want to live, with spirituality for me being a particular way of living that hopefully brings some sense of well-being. And I've purposely used that language rather than happiness, which is the probably preferred term for Sammy's age group, as they all want to be happy. Well, I'm up for being happy too, but I'd rather finally be well. And then the wholeness of life. And if you think about wholeness, the opposite for me is a disintegrating or fragmented life. And certainly that characterizes much of life in our contemporary culture. So I'm for wholeness of life. Last time we finished, I was working at the beginning with an acronym called PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, which is found, I'm using the resource from Positive Psychology. And we looked at the first P, PERMA. The P stood for positive emotions. And so you think about the role of positive emotions as opposed to negative emotions in the thrust of well-being and wholeness of life. The E stood for engagement, obviously the opposite of disengaged. So if you can manage to live a life that's engaged, connected to, there are other ways to talk about that. So that's really where we were the last session. And so today we'll jump into it in that sense. And if I can, I don't see the little arrows here. Ryan, where are they? Oh, there they are. All right, so the R in PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, the R stands for relationships. And it's probably hard to overestimate how important relationships are in the schema of well-being and wholeness of life. One of the people that I've enjoyed reading over some time now is Daniel Kahneman, who's a bit of an eccentric psychologist. And he has 2 or 3 things here that I would like to share. This comes from a fairly recent book of his. He says, the second best predictor of how we feel about a day is contact with family or friends. And secondly, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that happiness is the experience of spending time with people you love and who love you. I suppose that's really a simple statement, but it is so true. So I remember saying earlier in one of the other two sessions that in my time hanging out with our athletic department coaches, one of the phrases I hear time and time again is, well, control what you can control. It doesn't make any sense to try to control what you can't control. And I think one of the things that we often have a lot more control than we think about is developing relationships. And you can see how the E in PERMA, the engagement piece, fits nicely with relationships. So if you don't have a close family, or if we're old enough that most of our immediate family, as in a spouse or somebody, has already died, then they're friends, and certainly Kindle affords the opportunity for that possibility. So spend time developing relationships. And then a final observation, which I've seen in any number of different studies: being poor makes one miserable, and being rich may enhance one's life satisfaction. But study after study will show once we hit a level of about $75,000, more money doesn't necessarily improve our experience of well-being. So it's really not true that people who are incredibly wealthy, or even very wealthy, or just wealthy, it's not true that they will be experiencing more well-being. So study after study will show that if we can manage about $75,000, having more does not necessarily make it better. That's an interesting figure for me. I would guess that probably most of us on this call would be hitting that mark, or at least close to it. So think about the role of relationships. And I have more to say about relationships. I'm going to continue to use Kahneman. He says the general conclusion is as clear for well-being as it is for colonoscopies. People's evaluation of their lives and their actual experience may be related, but they're also different. And what he's trying to do is to poke at the difference between our actual experience and our evaluation of our lives. They're related, but they're not the same thing, is what he's really saying. I'm on Twitter, and I sent a Twitter to my college friends last night. We're in the last week of our semester, and my comment was, last impressions are the lasting impressions. And so what happens today is more present in our mind than what happened a month ago. And I think that's the point. So our actual experience may be such that we would make some statement about where we are today, but our life evaluation is not based on the most recent experience. The next thing he says here is one that I would love to have more time to explore, and we could do this a little if people have some observations. He says there, goals make a large difference. And when I spend time with Sammy's age group, it makes a lot of sense to talk about goals and to help them get clear about goals, and to have goals makes sense in their lives, as I said. I don't know what goals serve, what purpose they serve when we think about folks who are more at the Kindle at home stage. And so I would welcome if some of you have some comments. I think you have the availability of the microphone, so to speak. What kind of role does goals now have in your life at your age and at my age? I'm going to align myself with all of you. As you think about goals, do you have goals? Do goals play a role in your lives in a way that maybe they did when you were in your 30s, or when you were a college kid like Sammy is? Any reflections? I'll pause for a minute to see if anybody wants to jump in, and I'd love to hear. So what are the roles of goals? We'll turn it into a rhyme.
is Alan, joining you by phone only.
Good
Can you
enough.
hear me?
We can hear you.
Well, first, I'd like to tell you that in 2019, after paying Kendall at home, I lived on $32,000 a year. I cannot remember the last time I made $75,000 a year, period. The other thing, since you're talking about goals, I have very few. My goals are rather short term. I want to finish the dishes today. I have a to-do list. I write my to-do list since I'm a Luddite. And that's about it. I want to get a good night's sleep tomorrow and start over tomorrow with another to-do list, some of which is left over from today. And I'm in recovery. I'm in recovery in 4 programs, and I have a meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. and I'd like to be there, but that's about it. Oh, I want to go shopping after that meeting.
Okay,
So I
Thank you
have
for
pretty
sharing.
much given up on goals in my life.
great. Thank you for
It
sharing.
creates expectations, and in my experience, expectations are sometimes an invitation to pain, failure, and a bunch of, would you call them negative valence?
Negative
feelings?
emotions. Yeah,
Yeah, negative valence emotions. That's not always true.
good. Thank you, Alan.
The next goal would be to be with my grandchildren Saturday, and that's about it. Very short term. I
Yeah.
pass.
That's good. Thank you.
This is Nancy in Oberlin, and my goals feel very pedestrian, but the really real things I think about are getting everything finished, getting all those papers sorted. I'm 79 years old. Those family photographs, letters my dad wrote home from World War II, updating our trust and our powers of attorney and advance directives. Just all that paperwork. Those are my goals, and I'm not moving very fast on them.
Thanks, Nancy. Well, I think I like what Alan suggested about short-term goals. Pedestrian goals are not bad. Probably college students could do with some pedestrian goals as well. But just think about, at least the studies will show us that having goals, which I think are different than expectations, we can explore that, but I wouldn't. Having goals probably give us a better chance of having a sense of well-being, because I think they do reflect on relationships. To have a goal of having even a better relationship, a deeper relationship. Let's just read the last bullet point from the Kahneman piece. The goals that people set for themselves are so important to what they do and how they feel about it, that an exclusive focus on experienced well-being is not tenable. We cannot hold a concept of well-being that ignores what people want. So I think he's making a connection between what we want and the goals that we may set. So let's move ahead. Even more on relationships. You can see that for me, I'm wanting to underscore how important the R is in PERMA, that relationships, I really think are a key to wellness, well-being, wholeness of life. I wanted to bring this piece in on focusing on illusion. Kahneman says, nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it. That's probably a more sophisticated version of me saying, well, last impressions are lasting impressions. So if a student misses say tomorrow's class, I'm going to be more likely to remember that next week when I'm writing grades than I am whether they were in class in September. And I think that's what he's talking about is if today stinks, it's probably not as important as I think it is, even though I'm thinking about it. So for me, that's worth keeping in mind at our age and stage, because we may not feel 100% like we did when we were younger. Maybe we will, but to realize that well-being is what we're after. And nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you're thinking about it. And then he offers another observation. Your mood is determined by whatever you think about. And it would be fun for some time, and I don't plan to take the time now. It would be some fun, though, to think about how much choice do I have about what I think? Do I have a real choice about what I decide to think about? And at least I think I would start the conversation by saying, I think I have a fair amount of, I may not have total choice of what I think about, but I have quite a lot of choice. It's like, can you choose what you pay attention to? And I think, yeah, for the most part, I can. And so one of the things that Sammy and I are doing in the class we're doing together is really probably suggesting people pay attention to different things than they normally do. Like you may be spending too much time on your cell phone, which is an issue with Sammy's crowd. So we may have some role in determining a mood, and relationships can certainly affect our moods. And in his final bullet point, as we're doing more on relationships, adaptation to a new situation, whether good or bad, consists in large part of thinking less and less about it. Interesting. Maybe we would have to ponder that a bit, which is why I think you invite me to come along and just provide some things to think about. Adaptation to a new situation, whether good or bad, consists in large part of thinking less and less about it. The final thing I want to say on relationships is to cite the extensive longitudinal study that's been going on at Harvard since the 1930s. It's now well into 80 years. Harvard originally chose this very unlikely group of Harvard, at that point, men undergrads, and began to follow them in this longitudinal study. And since then, they've added women, they've added minorities, they've added different socioeconomic, but it's still the same study. And they're on their fourth director now, whom I heard recently. Each year they bring them in, they interview them, they send them through a physical. Obviously, many of the original folks are now long deceased, and they have a few grandkids of the original members in there, this ongoing 80-year plus study. And really the base finding in that, in terms of what accounts for people's sense of well-being, what makes a good life, is really summed up in this one word: relationships. It's not career, it's all these other things that we might speculate. What tends to make people feel like they've had a really good life are relationships. So that is really worth thinking about, whether you're a member of a Quaker meeting, and as I know some of you are, and there are good relationships there. Kindle at Home, I know, tries to foster that. That's behind the whole Quaker thrust in doing these retirement communities. So think about the role of relationships and continue to build that in. So let's move along. The M in PERM, P-E-R-M, is the word meaning. It would not be a surprise, I would assume, to anybody that to live a life that's well and to experience wholeness of life probably only comes if I think that life makes sense, if there's meaning in life. And I'm going to quote somebody probably, I'm assuming most people don't know. Langdon Gilkey is now deceased. He was a really wonderful creative theologian at the University of Chicago. I wouldn't say I was friends with Langdon Gilkey, really interesting person. But I'm lifting two quotations out of a book that I still use in classes some. It's called Shantung Compound, written in the 60s. Gilkey was fresh out of Harvard College as an undergrad, had gone to what now is Beijing, Peking in the time framework he went there, and he was teaching in a English-speaking school in Beijing at the outbreak of World War II. At some point, the Japanese came into China and rounded a bunch of people like Gilkey up and put them in a compound, in an internment camp. They were effectively prisoners of war, but they weren't in jail in the traditional sense of jail. But in the beginning, there were about 2,000 of these people from really Brits who were in China, a bunch of Catholic monks and priests, people like Gilkey, Americans, and some other countries. There were some Belgians there. And basically there's this group of 2,000 strangers put in this very small area. It's something like, if you can imagine putting 5 or 6 football fields together and telling 2,000 people you have to live there and you have to figure out basically how you want to do it. And as it turns out, of course, when they went in there, they obviously didn't know how long it was going to last. And I use the book because it's a wonderful study of how human beings really create a civilization from scratch. And the people who were the most useful and the most necessary in the beginning were the physicians, people who knew how to cook, and some of those basic things. And they managed that pretty well, pretty quickly. And then the story moves into what I might call the softer stuff. And early in the book, Gilkey, who had been moderately religious, a fairly liberal household, about a third of the way through the book, he concludes this stuff about God is irrelevant. We need doctors. We need, in a sense, people who knew how to do real things. But then some things in the community started happening. People began to start stealing some of the stuff. The morale went down. What he realized was people were basically operating out of a sense of self-interest, and self-interest leads to greed or selfishness pretty easily. And he begins to conclude, you know, without morality, without some sense of character, and then he discovers without meaning, life here doesn't make any sense. We can put the materials things together and make it, but if we don't get our moral and spiritual act together, this place has not got a chance. And so these quotations come from that book and reflect this. And this is how he defines meaning, which I find an interesting way to go. It's a sense of wonderful purpose in what we do and the life we live. And this could be a whole afternoon conversation around the coffee table with you and whoever we want to bring in. Do you have a sense of wonderful purpose in what you do and the life you're leading? And then he says, a person possesses a sense of meaning when we feel there's a vital connection between the goals we value and the activities and relationships in which we're involved. So is there a connection between what you value and the activities and relationships in which you're involved? And it's easy for me to see how Kindle is trying to help us experience that. I can see how a local Quaker meeting for worship or a Roman Catholic parish tries to address that. And so part of what I want to do here is simply remind you of how important having meaning in life is. And if some of us on the call don't have it, we could probably start getting it. And the key to it will be some of the other elements in PERMA, some positive emotions, some engagement, some relationships. And then the second observation Gilkey offers, as you can see one page later, he says, without meaning, we are undirected and a vulnerable prey to all manner of despair and anxiety, unable to stand firm against any new winds of adversity. So I don't propose today to try to separate meaning and purpose. So often they go together. So think about life and appreciate the role that meaning and purpose has in your sense of well-being and your sense of having a life that's whole rather than fragmented. And we get a sense of meaning in terms of telling people what we value, what we appreciate. There's the goals thing again, even if they're short-term goals, or as Nancy said, pedestrian goals, that's fine. The next slide I want to share, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to put this one in there, but I decided I would like to, because I want to, this is almost like the goal slide. Another aspect of meaning, as Gilkey and Kahneman and some other people I read, has to do with ambition. And I thought, oh, I mean, I'm at the age where most of you are. What kind of ambition do I have, or have I given up ambition? Am I over it? Well, let's read what Gilkey says about ambition. And I simply recall that he's writing out of a context of an internment camp, not sure when he was ever going to get out of there, wondering whether he would ever get out of there. Ambition varies with the meanings to which a person's life is devoted, and with the relation of those meanings to the work that he or she does. Ambition is called out only by strongly held values to which a person feels are attainable through his efforts or her efforts. And let me frame that a bit, and then I'm going to invite you all to share if you have some insight. One of the things that Gilkey discovered in the camp was people who might have on the outside been very ambitious, if they think about career or other ways, inside the internment camp had little to no ambition. And I hadn't ever thought about that, but it was an interesting thing to think about, is what is ambition? Do I have it anymore? Is it worth having? And I certainly want to take it out of the career context, although Sammy may want to keep it in there. And ambition has, for me, more to do with it than just that. Let's read the last bullet point, and then I would invite you to reflect with me on ambition and whether it has a role in our lives today. Gilkey says there's a connection between significance and local context. And local context for him was the internment camp in the moment. Local context for us may be our life at home, our life in a Kindle context. So we have a whole particular context. And does the context have significance? So let me invite you, if you want to share something verbally, this is the time I would love to hear. What are your thoughts on ambition? Do you have any? Do they play a role? And Sammy, maybe you have something to say about ambitions from a younger perspective.
Yeah, for me, so I kind of like think of ambition and passion are kind of related in that sense for me. But like obviously we're at different points in our lives. So for me, ambition is kind of what pushes me and like my drive as far as academics go. Like right now I want to get good grades and I want to graduate college so I can get the job that I want. So like that's going back to the goals thing, like they're kind of like building blocks, I guess, to building the life that I want and the job I want to get and how I want to accomplish that. So all of that kind of is my drive for getting good grades and working hard in school and all of that. So that's kind of my view on it from being a freshman in college.
And Sammy's talking with probably many more years and a much longer future than most of the rest of us on this call. And so I'm interested in those of us at the other end, which we may have many less years than Sammy does in terms of future. So any reflections from the older set in terms of ambition?
Yeah, I'll say something. I'm Judy Baca.
Please, Judy.
Yeah, ambition is a very big word. So it could be very subtle or it could be very pointed. So for people who went into the internment camp and had ambition to be, whether they were there politically or as business people or educated, or they had to fulfill those roles, suddenly the context, that local context, was wiped out, just diminished, gone. So then how do you find a new goal, a new set of context, a new meaning, a new value for your ambitions? What do you want to accomplish in a new space? And that kind of, watching the arc of my life, who I was, what I did before I had moved to Kendal and so on. So who am I in the context of where I am now? So that through thread of being who I am and keeping on to discover who I am is sort of an old goal, but it's a new goal because my context has changed so much. So it was always about who am I as in my career, who am I as a student, who am I as a mother, who am I as a wife, so now who am I as a grandmother? Who am I? Who am I without the jobs that I had, which were part of my very important local context and must be and need to be. When I went to a birthday party once for friends who had just turned 40, and there was a mixed group of people who were 40 and older and people who were in their 30s. And we all ran around and said, what is it that you're looking for right now in your life? And the 30-year-olds were still very much appropriately involved with, I want to do better at my job, I want to buy the new house, I want to become a parent, and the people who are 40 and over and saying, well, not that I want to do those things, I just want to feel comfortable and good within what I have already established. So it certainly is stage appropriate and age appropriate to look at ambition, but overall the value, the meaning of our values goes on forever. And of course the outer shape of that changes, but discovering who I am, where I don't have the world reflecting back to me in all the ways that it used to me is the most important thing. And that has to do with well-being and my spiritual. To me, that's the most important thing, because that's what I'm going to carry and how I invest that in relationships and my loved ones. And that's it. That's my goal. That's my goal, to see how well I can love and how well I have left love behind when I go. Something like that.
Thank you for that.
This is Alan coming in by phone again. I cannot relate to the word ambition, and I'll add, I cannot relate to that word anymore. I mean, I can reflect back when I was young and having over-the-top ambition. And my long ago deceased mother pointed that out to me, and she was right. I want to back up, if I may, to relationships. When I am sane, the most important relationship is my conscious contact with whatever word you use. I use the word God. My conscious contact with God. But I am very distractible by people, places, things. Just so distractible that I almost always am not in conscious contact with what I call God and that relationship. So I'm going to pass.
It's very helpful. And I appreciate you saying that you can't relate to the word ambition anymore. That was a question I had in my mind, and maybe being the kind of person I is, that's why we're having this discussion. I wanted to see what people would say. And the other thing that I would just point out, Judy, I love the fact that you tied in the whole issue of identity so clearly with this conversation. The who am I? In some ways, the who am I is the who do I want to become, and ambition relates to that, or goals. And the quest is to have a life of meaning, and context does matter. Anyone else want to jump in? Ryan, you're kind of in the middle between Sammy and many of us in terms of age. Any comments from your perspective? Ryan may not be with
I was
us.
going to say, if it lets me take back control of my screen, I can talk on it.
You're the control guy, so go ahead if you want.
Yeah, for me, similar to what Sammy kind of said, it's looking forward on it. I think for me, it's where you are and how you interact with people on it. And I think that's, for me, ambition is very relationship focused to it. I think it's also very career focused. But I think that just depends on where you are in life on it. I think that, as I've noticed, as I have aged, and I feel weird saying that at 23, but as I've aged, and grown up and seen what my younger brother and my younger cousins are thinking about and what their ambitions are. I mean, my youngest cousin right now, he's playing a lot of baseball, and his thing is trying to get to the best baseball player he can be. And that's what's driving him in his ambition. And that's what's putting him in the gym. That's what is putting him on the ball field after class and everything there. And I look back, and I was like him at one point. Then things kind of started to change, and things started to be, well, I need to get into the best school I can get into. I need to get the grades that I need to, and I need to get there. And so then the ambition shifted there. Now ambition is focusing a little bit more towards career path and how you can make the most impact in the world there. But then at the same time, a lot of ambitions, just like, just what makes, what causes, I know it's a taboo word, as you said before, but happiness. Like what causes that happiness to it? And it's like, being around family. I mean, Alan, I was talking to you before where I said that I moved here to Ohio from New York back in March. I left all my friends behind, all my family's back in New York. My girlfriend's in Northern Jersey right now. All of them are 500 miles away. So where can you make those relationships, and where can you achieve that happiness and actualize that life fulfillment that you want? And I think that that's where I'm starting to see this ambition is trying to head into more of a personal approach as opposed to a career or a materialistic approach.
I appreciate that. And as you all are talking, I'm thinking about there really is a connection between ambition, if we continue to use that word, if we want to use goals, to the issue of what we want. And if we change what I want, then that probably changes my ambition. So I'm wondering if ambition or goals aren't an expression of what we want. And I think one of the keys to well-being and wholeness of life is to get really clear about what we want and to make sure what we want is really worthwhile. That's the valuing piece. And I think to do that means we need to be more conscious than a lot of people in our culture are. Actually, I think there's a lot of robotic living and people living on automatic and so habitual that they aren't really thinking about life. And in that sense, they're not really in charge. So I'm suggesting that at least we spend a little time being clear. That's very familiar Quaker language to most of you, getting clear about what is it that I want? And is that something I value? Is that going to lead to wellness? Part of my critique of happiness is I'm not against it, but happiness tends to be more event driven, more temporal. So the fact that I was happy today doesn't mean I'll wake up happy tomorrow, kind of thing. So I'm intrigued by that. Really the core piece, and this will go back to what Judy said about identity, is identity includes what do I want? And that usually is a way of talking about how do we lean into the future, whether that's short term, as Alan was saying about goals, whether they're pedestrian, as Nancy was talking about, what do I want? And we have quite a bit of control over what we want and then how we pull together some activities to go around that. I want to do the last slide with us. I think it's the last slide. There we go. The A in the acronym PERMA, P-E-R-M-A, the A is achievement. And I thought, good, let's see what achievement means. We can, at our age, talk about things we have achieved. Conlon makes a really interesting distinction to me between what he calls the experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self can always tell you in the moment, like, does it hurt now? Or are you happy now? That's the experiencing self. The remembering self obviously is long-term, it's memory. It's dealing with the past. And it asks the question, how was it on the whole? And happiness will tend to be an experiencing self response. I'm suggesting well-being and wholeness of life will be the response from the remembering self. And so if you're asking somebody, do you think you're living life wholly, W-H-O-L-Y, L-L-Y? They'll think over a longer period of time, I would suggest, rather than just, wow, was it a good morning? And so I value this distinction that I'm pretty confident Kahneman's making. And for me, it's a real distinction, and we could see whether you think it's a real one or not. But if we're only people in the moment, we're really experiencing the self. From our perspective now, as people who are older, we can be asked, so how was it on the whole? And Judy can reflect back on her life as she did very briefly with us. And she brings it to the present. And then she made a future statement about wanting to live as well as I can in a loving way, something like that. I would probably summarize what Judy said going forward is she wants to end it all being a good lover of kids, of grandkids, of friends, And I think, wow, what a worthy goal. That's probably going to go a long ways towards making a meaningful life and making it as well as possible for her. So I value this remembering self. And when I am with Sammy and her gang over the next couple classes that we have left, I'm going to be poking at their remembering self. I was going to say, remember we started way back in August? How was it on the whole? So I'm going to ask that longer term question. And I think achievement, if we talk about achievement over the life, has to do with that remembering self. So how was it on the whole? And then the final thing that I'd like to bring to us today, I'm dipping back into Erik Erikson, a wonderful book that came out, I think probably in the 50s or maybe early 60s, in which it's Childhood and Society, I think is the name of the book. But he identifies these 8 developmental stages of human life. And I haven't tried to figure out what are contemporary psychologists doing with Erikson, partly because I still like what he does. And if it's all wrong, I don't want to know it. How's that? But what I've given here in these 2 bullet points under the developmental stages of human, these are the developmental stages 7 and 8, the last 2. You may or may not know Erikson's work, but the beginning stage, which I actually spend quite a bit of time with when I'm working with groups, the beginning stage that babies or infants first start negotiating is whether to trust or mistrust the world. And for the most part, that's done with mother, and then maybe with mother and dad and the very closest people the baby infant is associating with. And if the baby has a really unfortunate upbringing, we understand why the baby would have a basic perspective on the world of mistrusting, because they could get hurt, and every turn they do get hurt. So the best deal we could give kids is to help them experience their earliest stage in life as a trustworthy stage. So that was the first one. As we get to the end, as we've developed, interestingly to me, Erikson says one of the keys to the good life is that we maintain this sense of generativity, and he contrasts that with stagnation. And I think, oh, what a good way to imagine living on out the days and years of life, whether it's 1 more or 20 more, whatever. What does it mean for me at my age and stage? I liked what Alan said, I think, or maybe it was Judy. What does it mean for my age and stage to still be generative? It doesn't mean necessarily doing new things or necessarily doing more things or what I used to do, but what does it mean to generate rather than stagnate? And I thought, okay, let's open the mics again, if we were in a room, and see, as you think about being generative, Nancy was talking about going through the family albums, and she wants to generate something out of that, I'm assuming. Otherwise, she'd just leave it be. So as you think about your life, how would you characterize it, or how would you like to characterize it as being generative instead of stagnating? Mike's open. Anybody want to contribute? I'd love to hear. All right, no responses. You either got nothing to say or it was too hard a question. You need time to think about it. And that's fine. We'll finish up here pretty soon, but think about, I'm suggesting that to have some sense of generativity, and I can think about it in really small ways. I think to pray or to meditate, you think about some of the classic spiritual disciplines, is quite generative because you're continuing to generate and regenerate relationships. If Judy and I were one-on-one, I would say, so how do you continue to be loving? To be loving is to be generative. To pay no attention to the other is to begin stagnating. It probably bodes poorly for the relationship and probably can lead to some despair or hopelessness. So think about being generative in those small ways, not necessarily where you're going to write a novel or you're going to do something that's, the kind of stunning thing that people tend to think about. And then the final stage, which Erickson points us to, is what he calls ego integrity versus despair. And I'm quoting from Erickson now. Only in him or her who in some way has taken care of things and people and has adapted to the triumphs and disappointments adherent to being, only that person may gradually ripen the fruit of these 7 previous stages. And I'm going to tell you, I think integrity is just another word for wholeness. So it's having that sense of integrity, of oneness, of wholeness, in some ways of having it together rather than falling apart. That's what I think Erickson's pointing us to. And maybe it's the last developmental stage of life, which we've been working on these many years. I'm not sure I would use the word ego, but he does. So I just shared that with you. But that sense of well-being and wholeness has to do with living an integrated life as opposed to a fragmented life or a disintegrating life. And this last bullet point you can see there, he points us in the direction of acceptance and satisfaction. And I really like the word satisfaction. For me personally, it's preferable, at least long-term, to happiness. Because I think satisfaction can be sustained in a way that happiness can't. So am I living in a way that's accepting life, in a way that's finding satisfaction? And Alan, I think it was, that talked about conscious contact with God. That resonates with me. If I have that as my ambition, I'm going to use that word. If I'm clear that that's my most important thing, that I've got the value piece in place, then I can accept what comes along. I can accept my context and where I am. So those two, for me, are important, maybe particularly at our age and stage, and something for which people like Ryan and Sammy can look forward to at some point. That sense of generativity starts probably in career, certainly comes with having children, but it means something different for people my age and probably the age of many of you, Nancy and Alan, perhaps. So let me step back. That's what I'm bringing today. Are there reflections? We have just a few minutes left, 4 minutes or so, according to my clock. Observations, comments I would welcome. Judy?
Yeah, just to say thank you very much. I just love hearing things I think about and ponder about all the time, coming from all different perspectives and different resources and different languaging of things that I ponder in my own context. And it always, just even thinking about the word ambition, which for me implies a certain competitive nature. So I'm not ambitious in that way, but I do have goals and meanings and associations with becoming who I want to become. It's just all of it. It's just it's very stimulating to me. And I thank you very much.
You're welcome. Love having you with me. Other observations, comments? Sammy?
I just like listening to everyone else's perspective on things like achievement and ambition, because like obviously we're at very different points in our lives. So I honestly have never thought about any of these things from like an older perspective, because I've never really, I guess, had a reason to. I just always think about like my future and like what I'm doing to create the life that I want someday. So it's really interesting to hear you guys all talk about like looking back on your life. And yeah, it's just really interesting and a new experience for me.
Super. Love having you. Anyone else want to make a comment here in the end? We have a small group, which is wonderful. Ryan, do you have any concluding words from the Kindle perspective?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Alan, thank you again for doing this today. It was a great conversation, I thought, and as Sammy said, it was great to hear everyone's perspective throughout. I think that that's something very special about these sessions, where you have these groups where you're able to discuss and you're able to get different perspectives throughout, that may be different than things that you've experienced or the people that you've known personally for a long time that have experienced. So, but in terms from Kendal, thank you all very much. Alan, I believe the next it's next Tuesday, correct?
That's right.
Yeah, so next Tuesday at 2, December 7th is our final section in this 4-part series. So hope you all can make it, and looking forward to seeing you all again next week.
All right. It'll be next month, next time.
Next
How
month,
about
yes.
See you all. Thank you. Peace and blessings.